This is the Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 6, The Veil and Its Symbols. In this podcast episode, we will be looking at the tarot, and with us is a special guest, Mr. Stuart Sudekum. Stuart is a writer and educator currently residing in Brooklyn, New York. He's lectured on the Western esoteric tradition for a number of organizations and institutions, including the New York School of Visual Arts, Morbid Anatomy Museum, and the Seattle Esoteric Book Conference. His writing has appeared in periodicals such as Clavis Journal and Heathen Harvest, and he's presently preparing to publish a 2-volume study on Arthur Waite's Rectified Tarot, which will be the first to analyze the symbolism of the cards Waite designed in the context of all of his publicly available works. Mr. Sudekum also provides guitar and vocals for Apibus, A-P-I-B-U-S, an experimental folk music ensemble. So it was a great interview. We had a lot of fun, very informative. Stuart's a great guy. So here you go. Let's get into it. Okay, here we are. And we've got Stuart Sudekum on the podcast. We're honored to have you here, Stuart.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
And we have got Janice here, as always.
Hello.
What's happening, Janice?
Hey, what's going on?
So, yeah, thanks for joining us. So, Stuart, we have you on here to talk about the tarot, specifically the Waite-Smith tarot. But first, can we maybe hear about how you got into the tarot to begin with? How did this all start for you?
Sure. Well, actually, I got to know Arthur Waite before I got to know his tarot. I first encountered his work on Paracelsus when I was 16, and I guess to one degree or another, that discovery has directed me down the path to where I am today. I'll be 32 in August, so that was just about half a lifetime ago. But I was given Waite's tarot as a gift by a friend back in college. It must have been 2008 or 2009 or something. But this friend was a stage magician and a huge fan of Houdini. And interestingly, like Waite, Houdini started off in 19th century Spiritism because his little sister died and he wanted to get in touch with her. And both Waite and Houdini became skeptics and made it their business to unmask charlatans. Which seems to me like a pretty good way of having revenge on people who would manipulate people's faith and take advantage of their grief. But anyway, my magician pal was an atheist, or he is an atheist. He's still an atheist. And I'd like to think that even though Waite remained Catholic and the work that I've done on the tarot has made me more religious than I ever thought I would be, the work that I've done on the tarot should be of interest to any skeptic who wants to better understand religious iconography. And so at the time I recognized a lot of the symbolism in Waite's tarot because I had been reading Waite's work. And I told my friend, I'll learn how to read these cards. And he was like, that's ridiculous, but go for it. And so I was like, okay. And little did I know that was going to turn into a huge project. I started just writing in the margins of my copy of Waite's Pictorial Key to the Tarot. And those notes eventually outgrew the book. And they started to turn into a book of their own. And around the same time, people started asking me to show them things about the tarot because they knew that I understood a lot of this stuff that nobody else understood about it because I was reading Waite's work, which there's this whole myth that his work is like kind of unreadable or something, which is not true.
I agree. It's totally absurd.
Yeah, it makes no sense. It's like a comparison I've often made is like a lot of literary critics hate H.P. Lovecraft because he uses these deliberate archaisms.
Right.
And it's just like, well, yeah, but like you're completely missing the point of this word. If like you want to read like this like romantic subject matter in like some sort of like sterile like clinical language, I was reading Waite's work, and I realized that for some reason other people didn't seem to be. And the more that I looked around at like other people's interpretation of the tarot cards, I was like, no one has ever done any kind of study of Waite's tarot symbolism based on Waite's work. And it's still other than the work that I've done on it, to my knowledge, unless there's somebody working really, really privately, it still hasn't been done. So hopefully that will change in the next few years, because I'm in contact with a couple of people that are doing a lot of really great work with Waite's stuff, and that'll be available pretty soon.
Very cool. So are you working on a book, or what is it exactly?
Yeah, I have a 2-volume book that is probably going to be out in the next year or two. It just depends on stuff with publishers. It's drawn from some of the lectures that I was giving to my students, because as I said, I was teaching tarot card symbolism to people. And those lectures are actually the source for a lot of the material that you see in the Clavis Journal article that I wrote, Secret Tradition and Silence. And
excellent. And it's superb, and I recommend it to anyone listening. Please go pick up that Clavis 3. It's one of the best articles I've read on the Waite Smith Tarot, actually.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'm glad somebody read it. I kind of got the impression that no one had, but I guess people are just quietly working away, and I suppose that's how it works in esoteric fields. But yeah, the book is at least I've been trying to title it "A Guide to the Rectified Tarot of Arthur Edward Waite," because I feel like there isn't one, but the guys at the publisher say that is not nearly an exciting enough title. And so I'm toying with the idea of calling it "The Secret Tradition in Fragments, being a guide to the rectified tarot of Arthur Edward Waite, restoring the symbols upon the veil of nature to their ancient splendor for the benefit of the sick and the restoration of rusted iron to its former estate."
Yeah, that's good.
That's like a straight out of 1915 title. I love it.
Hey, it has the word secret in it, so it's going to be a hit.
I know. Actually, if you go through the catalogs of any of these esoteric publishers, everything is like the mystery this, the secret this. Like, there's pretty much not a title that doesn't have that in it.
Yeah, it's mandatory.
Yeah. So, anyway, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight is drawn from these same lecture notes. So you may have like heard some of this before if you saw me talk at Esoteric Book Conference, or you read the article. But feel free to jump in at any point and divert me if you have specific things that you want to hear more about.
Yeah, we'll probably give you the floor for most of it, but we might bump it here and bump it there just to unfold different aspects.
Yeah, I'm ready for you to just kind of go for it.
So let's pop it off with a question. So let's start in a simple way. What is the Waite Smith Tarot? And I want to ask you something related to that. What was the Waite Smith Tarot? And since it's become a little bit of a controversy, what exactly was Waite's role and what was Smith's role in creating this tarot? Because there's a lot of controversy. The people want to know. The people are screaming in the streets. They want to know the truth.
Okay, so well, it's the basics of this is that that Waite was the designer of these cards, and Smith was the artist that he hired to execute them. And there is a long history behind the tarot tradition that Waite is working in. And so I feel like in order to fully answer your question, I need to explain what tarot cards are and also where Waite came into them. Because tarot cards were originally a variety of playing cards that they're first attested in Renaissance Italy. And scholars' efforts to date them have usually placed them in the 14th century at the earliest and the 15th century at the latest. And most present scholars don't really buy the 14th century thing anymore. They favor that later date. But they were originally intended for gambling, and they're still widely used for that purpose across Europe. But they're generally decorated with the same variety of traditional patterns and symbols that are commonly seen in other early printed matter, such as the stylistic flourishes of book ornament or the trademarks of paper makers and printers. And you'll see similar iconography in woodcuts or engravings that are in emblem books. And all of these kinds of printed embellishments were modeled upon illuminations found in manuscript books that predate the printing press, which in turn descend from older types of ornament from a less literate Europe. Motifs that you'd see on textiles or coins or baked goods or jewelry or furniture or architecture. And a lot of those decorations are still so ubiquitous in everyday life that they've pretty much been rendered invisible because they're so commonplace, but they're out there. I live in New York City, where you can see traditional forms of European ornament on most older buildings just walking down the street. When my mom was last in town, we had a great time just walking around and taking in the city and talking about the stuff that we saw around us. But this tradition of tarot that Waite is taking part in doesn't really begin there. I mean, the iconography is older than the tarot, and so really, where does it begin? This is a hard question to answer. And the tarot as an organizational system or an iconographic framework is firmly in the Renaissance. Waite is not a Renaissance guy, so he has nothing to do with developing that. But the thing that Waite is a part of is something that starts in 1781. And this is when we get the first known public suggestion that the designs on tarot cards might contain information other than what's necessary to play games with them. And that appeared in the 8th volume of Antoine Courtegeblon's grand study, Monde Primitif, The Primitive World. And this guy, Courtegeblon, was a former Huguenot pastor. That's like a sort of French Calvinist. He was an early archaeologist, to use the term generously. He made a lot of stuff up. But in Monde Primitif, he proposes that the designs appearing on tarot cards originated in Egypt, where he alleges that they were used to explain the secret teachings of ancient Egyptian religion. He explains in the text that he was struck by this idea when he happened to catch a glimpse of one of the cards, the world trump, as a friend played the game. According to Courtegeblon's account, he asked to examine the rest of the deck, and in 15 minutes he had formulated the Egyptian origin theory and created a huge headache for Waite. So
you can still hear people today talking about the Egyptian origins of the tarot.
Yes, you can. In fact, I would venture to guess, though, I mean, there are a couple of guys named Decker and Dummett who have put out a bunch of books about tarot history that, although they're not perfect, they're pretty good. They're better than almost.
Yeah.
Well, I won't say they're better than almost anything. They really are better than anything, because the rest of I mean, I'm not going to speak negatively about other people's books, but tarot is a subject where there is a lot of work to be done by anyone who's just willing to invest their time in and really take a strong interest in unfolding the mysteries of the subject, because they haven't been. And the books that people have put out right now, by and large, don't even make an effort to uncover what's going on there.
Oh yeah,
But,
I agree. I would say, not to interrupt you for too long, but I would say, I agree with you, and that's why I'm so glad you're on the show, because aside from maybe Robert Michael Place, and I like Paul Hewson's book, Origins of the Tarot, and Decker. I mean, a lot of the other stuff that's coming out is just frankly garbage. I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's just, I see it as like a lack of creativity and a lack of interest. These are largely people regurgitating the same dumb ideas or like coming up with lazy new ideas. One of the big criticisms that Waite makes of fake origins of the tarot is that they're just so uncreative. That like a fake story, like the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. This is not like a story to take literally, but it's
right.
it's an allegorical narrative, which appears as like a kind of pseudo history to explain the life of the founder of Rosicrucianism, and anyone who believes that Christian Rosenkreuz was a real person just hasn't done any research on Rosicrucianism. And this is something that Waite got himself into some trouble for, because he didn't believe that that story was a true story. But he nonetheless devoted his life to Rosicrucian philosophy and did really amazing work with it. And so the thing is that, we can make invented stories and fantasies, and there's a lot to be gained from these, but there's nothing to be gained from just like spinning these like dumb yarns to like sell a book here and there. It's not like some of these like interesting stories from the past weren't done just for that, just to make a buck. But there's just there's total dearth of creativity from even Waite's time. He's observing this, and in our time it's worse. But the Egyptian origin theory is really one of the most tired theories about the tarot. And although we know now that this theory of origin is incorrect, I think it's important to say that Court de Gebelin wasn't just speaking at random. Like when he says that he formulated this idea in 15 minutes, it doesn't do credit to the fact that he'd been a Freemason for 10 years. And he doesn't talk about that in Long Primitif, but he couldn't help being struck by the fact that some of the imagery decorating the cards does seem to echo his fraternity's characteristic iconography. For example, the Pope, which in Waite's deck is called the Hierophant, he's depicted in front of two pillars. Justice is holding a scale. The Hermit is holding a lantern. The star and the world show an allegory of nature or truth, depending on who you talk to, in various states of nudity. And the Fool has a dog. The dog is rearing on its hind legs. It sort of looks like the constellation Sirius. And maybe the Fool is in a pose that looks a little bit like Orion. But the world has the four living creatures of Ezekiel and the Apocalypse. Now, if you aren't familiar with the symbol system of Freemasonry, like, it doesn't really matter that much, because although all of these things that I've been listing off will raise the eyebrow of someone who has been through some Masonic degrees, Waite designed his rectified tarot to be accessible to everyone. And he felt like these symbols really did belong to everyone, and that they're not native to Freemasonry any more than they're native to the tarot. But Masonry did have an important, what'd you say?
I was going to say no. In fact, it's Freemasonry that collected these things in order to preserve them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. When we look at Masonry, I think the best way to talk about it is that these were kind of the first guys doing comparative mythology. I mean, yep. there have been people doing things like that for a while, but I think that with Masonry, you get sort of like an organized school of what we today would consider comparative mythology, as like a sort of like a branch of religious studies. Because these, although they're working within a Judeo-Christian framework, this is something that to some extent, these guys were Joseph Campbelling it up before that was a thing.
Yeah, well, I also think it is significant to mention that although the tarot doesn't necessarily have Egyptian origins, the the Renaissance arose from the translation of the Hermetica, which was a Alexandrian rendering of Hermopolitan Egyptian ideas, and that in turn, those ideas coupled with then later Neoplatonic theurgy sort of produced the Renaissance as we know it, and the Renaissance is what produced the tarot. So there is the influence down the road, you could say. The influence of Egyptian theology is present, but through that filter of Renaissance European culture, which was actually and you have that Catholic overlay too.
Yeah, I think that this is a point that can be made, but although we have like Hermeticism as an Alexandrian school, I think that broadly speaking, the interest that we see in the Renaissance is coming from the influx of Greek stuff that with the fall of the Byzantine Empire and like the conquest of Constantinople and all of that, we get that stuff coming in an influx back into Europe as people are fleeing with it. You also have Moorish invasions bringing that stuff up too. Moorish Neoplatonism in Spain certainly had some influence there. It's a long and convoluted history. And, like to some extent, we can talk about the Mediterranean world in general as being something that was not disconnected from ancient Egyptian mythology, but the way in which it was portrayed in the 19th century is just totally wrong. And the origin that Court de Gebelin was giving at the end of the 18th century, this is like even more wrong.
So Stuart, when these cards were put together and these symbols were kind of placed together, do you think that maybe this wasn't even an unusual thing? I mean, they weren't created for esoteric purposes initially. Do you think this combination of symbolism was just, like you were saying earlier, just kind of the normal symbols seen in everyday life?
Absolutely. I would say that, even I don't want to give the impression that there was no symbolism prior to 1781. When I say they were created for gambling purposes, I'm just trying to emphasize that they weren't created by like a mystical order, as far as I know.
Sure.
They were created out of iconography, though, that absolutely has a religious history. Like the image of the Wheel of Fortune is a really good example. This is an idea that has been around for a really long time. It's a picture of an allegory of fate turning a wheel, and there are guys strapped to the wheel, and they're subject to the turning. The guy who's on top, maybe he's in charge for today, but the guy who is going down on the side, well, he was on top before, but the wheel keeps on turning, and somebody who's down, he's coming up next. So this iconography is attested long before tarot cards were attested, and so to some extent, these ideas really do connect back around to very ancient concepts, and we see them in use a long time before. And like explaining that symbolism is a large part of the work that I've done, but when it comes to like how did the tarot come together, like how did people choose this particular combination of images, I think the thing is that what they had to do was, when you're making a deck of cards for gameplay and you want to easily recognize the cards and distinguish them from one another, and you're going to make a sequence of cards that don't have pips on them. That is the little marks used to show like there's 2 hearts on the 2 of hearts or 3 hearts on the 3 of hearts in a modern playing card deck. The suits would have been different at that time, but it's the same idea. There in a tarot deck are 22 cards that don't have suits, and so they had to be able to tell them apart from one another, and so they have pictures on them and they have names, and these pictures would have just represented 22 pictures of iconography that was recognizable to the game players, and it's iconography that's all over the place. Like I said, it's on everything. It's on the sides of buildings. It's on people's clothes. It's in general, whether we're talking about the Renaissance or late 18th century, it's still a part of their lives, and to some extent, still a part of our lives, but maybe less than it used to be. We've started to move towards like the aesthetics of emptiness and minimalism a lot in the last couple of years, and so I don't think that houses that are built anew are going to have the sort of beautiful carvings and things like that, like William Morris would have designed.
Right.
But we still do have that kind of iconography in our daily lives, and it's not something that was absent from the lives of those people who were beginning to develop esoteric interpretations in the 18th century based upon Masonic training in interpreting old symbols. So to some extent, it's completely normal pictures of everyday life, but also normal everyday life is completely full of images that have a very deep symbolic and spiritual origin.
Very nicely said, Stuart. So from your research, when did people start using these cards for divination?
Well, this is interesting because the first account of divination that we have in like a written form is in Kortegeblen's encyclopedia. It's not written by him. He mentions at the end of his article on the tarot that Spanish playing cards are, during his time, being used for divination, and suggests that this is also something that can be done with tarot cards. But then he brings in this other guy, Comte de Molay, who he gives an account of tarot divination that has a lot of the same features of Kortegeblen's account, but there's a couple of weird things about it. In fact, it's so weird that it's kind of hard to explain in a lot of ways. He, for example, talks about the Egyptian origin theory without mentioning that the guy whose book he's published in has invented it. He seems totally unaware of Kortegeblen's paper. He describes meanings of the cards that are at odds with what came before it. What Kortegeblen writes, he either ignores or contradicts. So the theory that's arisen out of this by modern historians like Decker and Dummett is that Comte de Molay may have written what he wrote about tarot divination prior to Kortegeblen. And this raises the question as to whether or not Kortegeblen may be lying about his 15-minute creation of this origin.
Interesting.
So the reasons why he might lie about that are tied up with some of the Masonic stuff that we're talking about, because Kortegeblen was involved with the Rite of Philalethes and some other Masonic groups that are tied to the early history of Martinistic and Rosicrucian thought. This is a subject of like a lot of debate as to what was really going on at that time. I don't know if there's anyone who really knows. Maybe there's somebody deep in the instituted mysteries, like holding all the keys, but I certainly cannot explain this stuff. But suffice to say, Comte de Millais gives this account of tarot divination, and we actually have some stuff to prove that he's not just making it up off the top of his head. It would be way easier if we could say, okay, 1781, Freemasons just start making up meanings for tarot cards. Awesome. Job done. Case closed. But it's not really that easy, because we have some stuff from a few decades earlier where people have decks of cards that they've written meanings on. And this is in Italy, in Bologna. So those decks, some of the meanings that they've written down, these meanings match the ones that Comte de Millais gives. So it seems like there really was some kind of tradition, in as much as a tradition involves a meaning that is copied from one generation to the next generation. And it was copied by someone and handed down to the point where it reached these French Freemasons, and from there they started to develop their version of the system. And that early stuff from Italy is something that we don't have a lot of. And so we can't make a lot of absolute statements about it either. It could be that their system was really huge and fully intact, and this is just what we have of it. Or it could be that it was really sparse, and that there was not so much to it until Court-de-Gebelin and his pals got to it. But regardless, something happened in 1781 in the midst of all of that Masonic activity. And I think that we should also keep in mind that Cagliostro was running around at that time, and he was trying to promote this weird style of Egyptian, or rather pseudo-Egyptian Freemasonry that he had invented, and he was trying to make this big reformation of all Masonic doctrine and getting everyone to join his thing. And it didn't really work out for him. But this was in the air, and as much as these symbols were a part of daily life in 1781, at least within certain circles, that kind of fake Egyptian rumor was also a part of what was going on.
Well, and that's bound up with the Egyptomania of the day too. You know, the Egyptian revival, and that, you know, all of that, which was triggered by the translation of the Rosetta Stone and the, you know, the Carter's, you know, excavation of the tomb of Tutankhamun later. I mean, so there was this spirit of obsession with ancient Egypt and all things Egypt, which kind of like fed that even more, I think.
Yeah, that certainly fed it along the way. Though it bears mentioning that at the time that all of those late 18th century Freemasons were making their claims, sometimes they were based on philological stuff about the ancient Egyptian language. The Rosetta Stone had not yet been deciphered. No one could read hieroglyphics when Court-de-Gebelin was writing. So later on, all of those discoveries surely excited the imaginations of the Golden Dawn crowd and all of that. But for these guys, it is a little bit strange that they had developed these notions, but it's based on older sort of Masonic myths about the origin of the fraternity, that maybe they built the pyramids, or basically any wonder of ancient architecture. There's a story about how Masons built it, and
I thought it was the aliens.
Well, you know, This is also a school of thought. There were maybe not as many UFO conspiracists at the time, but I'm sure that there must have been one. There was probably an early UFO guy. I don't know. I'm not a scholar of UFO crackpots. It's actually a really interesting subject, like how interested people are in it. But yeah, with this kind of thing, you just sift through dubious account after dubious account, and you try to find some way of putting it together that makes sense. But that interest in Egypt and the crafting of weird fake Egyptian stuff out of it just continued to develop throughout the 19th century. You get the Rite of Mizraim being founded in 1805, and then later the Rite of Memphis in 1838, and then they merge into Memphis Mizraim in 1881. That's not too long before the Golden Dawn picks up the thread in 1888. And yeah, this is just something that was going on at that time, and it's part of the tarot's history, actually, that people are making up so many weird fake stories about it. But I think that certainly one of Waite's goals with the rectified tarot, which really was your question, is what is the rectified tarot? Or rather, you asked, what is the Waite-Smith tarot? And I suppose I should explain at some point why he called it the rectified tarot, which is tied up with all of this. But it was Waite's attempt to bring the symbolism back to its source. And he regarded any tarot that tried to do that as a rectified tarot. He mentions in his pictorial key that Oswald Wirth had made a rectified tarot some years before. And so Waite did not regard his attempt as the first attempt, but he did see it as something that needed to be done.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, and he did it admirably.
Well, I definitely see the Wirth tarot as a precursor to the Waite tarot. They're not identical by any means. They actually kind of work with a different Kabbalistic system. But I just think you can't know the Wirth tarot and the Waite tarot and not see almost like a line of development, different flowerings of a line of development that almost seem to want to happen on its own. I almost feel as if the tarot as you could almost say an entity or something was unfolding itself along these lines at this point and was ready to resynthesize.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that Waite saw what he was doing as part of a tradition and a trajectory. Although he, of course, spends a lot of time debunking those late 18th century guys, he obviously had respect for Kurt Gebelin at the very least. He was interested in all of these materials, though sometimes they weren't entirely truthful. And when he started to formulate all of this, he threw nothing away that he felt he could keep and turned to a different direction. He spent so much time dissing on Eliphas Levi, but it's at that time, if you weren't reading Levi, you didn't know what was going on with occultism. And so he tries to take some of that Egyptian stuff and work it back in ways that fit the symbolism. As long as the symbol came through and you could understand the meaning behind it, this is what mattered to Waite. He didn't really care about where it came from. Origins were not as important to him as the meanings. And so for him, these meanings were mystical. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that Saint Martin was related to those groups of Masonic thought at that time. There's all this other fake stories, that there's a Martinist rite of Masonry that he founded and things like that, and that's not true either. That's no more true than the Egyptian stuff, but certainly his books were being circulated, and people cared about it, and a lot of things were being said at that time about mysticism that Waite was taking very seriously. And so you see that in 1901 when he puts out his study of Saint Martin's life, and it's kind of also a summary of all of his books, which is helpful because many of those books are not translated into English still. And
although as a side note, quickly, Piers Vaughan is actually doing an excellent job with the translating of some of those books into English at this time.
Yes, and I am very grateful to him. I don't know him well, but I have met him, and I have rarely spoken to a person who has more eloquent things to say upon Waite or Saint Martin or any of these subjects. He's a really interesting dude, and I am very grateful for everything that he's doing and has done.
Yeah, he's wonderful.
Yeah. But yeah, Waite couldn't really have started planning his rectified tarot before he did all of that work and research on Saint Martin, or before he became a master mason. And those two things happened in the same year, in 1901. But by 1906, that's when we really start to see a clearly formed version of all of that stuff in Waite's own words, coming out in his studies in mysticism.
Just to pause you there, that leads into one of our questions about this. I wanted to know if you could, right along the same line that you're going right now, could you go into what the symbolist mindset is, and how Waite sort of employed that symbolist mindset, through mysticism? Because I'm not sure that anybody listening to this, when you say symbolist, they might not understand the full implications of that.
Sure, yeah. Waite's idea of symbolism was different than anybody's before, and I think probably different from anyone's since. Waite's idea of a mystic was one who could look, as he says, far behind these symbols. And the idea that there is something behind a symbol, that a symbol stands in for something else, is, I guess, implicit in the idea of symbolism. But Waite saw symbolism as a form of substitution, that when you cannot have something, when you cannot explain something or show something, it has to be substituted with something else. And this is always kind of a lesser thing. It's a thing that refers to its subject through a sidelong manner of speaking or manner of showing. And Waite makes a lot of comments in his works on mysticism about the way that that symbolism works. And I have a couple quotes pulled out here that I wanted to share with you guys. One is from Lamps of Western Mysticism, which is a later revision that he did of studies in mysticism. And I think that that Lamps might be one of my favorite books by him. It's really, if you want an introduction to Waite's work, I highly recommend this. It's got a lot of references to like older mystical thought, medieval mysticism and things like that, that might be a little bit off-putting for someone that doesn't know too much about it. But I find it way more approachable than Way of Divine Union, which is really heady stuff. It's I think Way of Divine Union is his ultimate and most important mystical work, and I think that anyone who's read Waite's works will probably agree. But Lamps of Western Mysticism also the earlier version, Studies in Mysticism, is vastly important if you want to understand what Waite is on about with all this stuff, including what he's on about with symbolism. But Waite says in this book that the living knowledge of God is not attained by reason. Its pictured representations are but a figure or a shadow of the greater work. It is water in comparison with wine. And that, I think, really puts into perspective that although Waite likes symbolism and cares a lot about symbols and their meanings, that the pictured representations are not the whole thing, that they're not the complete story. And he says some stuff along these same lines in his Shadows of Life and Thought. He says, it should be understood in conclusion that we are dealing here solely with pictured images, but the way of the mystics ultimately leaves behind the figured representations of the mind. It is behind the kaleidoscope of external things that the still light shines in and from within the mind, in that state of pure being, which is the life of the soul in God. And I mean, that is Waite's whole philosophy in a nutshell. When we look at his tarot cards as a collection of symbols that he's put together, we have to understand that the reason that he has put them together is because he has something to communicate, and it's not arbitrary. It's not read in. He really has something to say, and he believes the symbols had that to say before he got to them. And this is one of the things that makes the question of like who put the symbolism in the tarot a really difficult one, because the symbols are older than the tarot, and the images themselves are not the symbolism. So there's really a lot of strange questions raised by this way of looking at the cards. But there's a clarification that I think is helpful, that's in Way of Divine Union, where he says, we speak inevitably in terms of space and time and can approach things unseen only in a language of symbolism, borrowed from the world of sense. And so that, I think, that like drives home the fact that like really like we've got no other choice. If we're going to talk about stuff beyond words, we still have to do it with words. We still have to figure it in pictures, and that we are to some extent limited by this, but we can find ways of getting around that limitation, and that's what we do anytime that we engage with a symbol from a mystical perspective.
That was really well put. I'm really grateful that you articulated that way. I just think that's the essence there. And you're talking, I mean, that's the aim of poetry. I went and saw the Rose Croix exhibition at the Guggenheim last year.
Oh my God, I did too. Did you get the red velvety book that you could get of all the stuff?
No, I didn't, and I'm kicking myself for it. I plan on getting it though. But I mean, Peladon, really the symbolist movement was all about what you're talking about. And the aim was exactly what you articulated. I'm not even going to bother reiterating it because you summed it up so well there. But, that's...
Yeah, Waite was totally steeped in that. And when you talk about the symbolist movement, this is specifically, I guess, for the benefit of the listeners, the art exhibition that we're talking about is something that happened in France with the Rose Croix Salon that was going on there, or I guess you say it Rose Croix Salon if you're really French. I'm going to say a lot of things wrong. I don't speak French, but that movement was something that it spun out of the whole broader romantic movement, and the pre-Raphaelites are sort of, I guess, from one perspective, a branch of the symbolists. But these painters are all kinds of, they're interconnected, and it's very much a world that interpenetrated with the esoteric discussion that was happening at that time too.
Hey, Stuart, Do we have examples of? You said that Waite was rectifying the tarot. Of examples of tarot decks that were inferior or flawed that required this upgrade.
Yeah. For example, the older images that Waite is working from are primarily the French ones that you see in the Tarot of Marseille. These would have been the ones that those Masons were working with. And a lot of times they vary around a certain territory, but they'll have like a few differences. And Waite saw those differences as the product of people just sort of mindlessly copying things they didn't understand. And sometimes you see a symbol that was pretty clear degrade into sort of like a weird blobby shape in the next copying because it's just not understood, or it's being done quickly or being done in a way that's sloppy. And I guess Court de Geblin's images that he provides in the Monde Primitif are not really perfect either. Waite takes some elements from them and talks about them a lot, but when he says that the tarot is rectified, what he's talking about is not just that he fixed it. What he's actually doing is it's a complicated play on words. When we rectify a spirit, that is distilling alcohol, and this is an alchemical process, and it connects with Waite's interest in mystical alchemy. And also, one very important thing to note about the Masonic connections in the rectified tarot is that there was in Germany a thing called rectified masonry, and this is the rite of strict observance. The rite of strict observance was a German rite of Freemasonry that claimed to have Templar origins. This is, again, one of these mythical origins of Freemasonry, but although this is not something that we can probably take like 100% seriously, there was some serious myth making going on. These were stories that captivated Waite's imagination, and in the rite of strict observance, you had elements that would get absorbed into the Knights Beneficent of the Holy City, and this is the Martinist rite that Willermaz would make in France. This is tied up with a lot of the people that were around Court de Geblin. And so when he says this is the rectified tarot, it's not just that he's like taking these symbols back to their like basic truths or whatever, we're trying to express something that he sees as far behind the symbols, but he is also, from like a historical perspective, trying to reconnect based on his knowledge of the rite of strict observance and basically like every other Masonic group that you could possibly imagine that existed then in England or existed basically at any time, anywhere. He took all of that learning and he rolled it into the rectified tarot. This is one reason why I say he could not have started planning to make this prior to 1901, because he was not yet a master mason. And I think that it took him probably, it's my opinion, that I don't know how many years it took him to get into the high degrees, but I think that within a couple of years, he would have been through the Royal Arch, and there's probably evidence of that sitting around somewhere. Maybe it's even somewhere public, but I haven't looked at it yet, and it's a lot of information to parse. But the rectified tarot, both in its major arcana and minor arcana, bear the stamp of the rite of strict observance and the Elicoan and CDCS and all of that stuff. And this is one of the reasons why this absurd affirmation that's been going around that Pamela Coleman Smith designed the minor arcana or any element of the tarot is just, it's not just not plausible, it's impossible. And there's also not one shred of evidence that she even understood the symbolism much less that she made it herself. And the work that Waite had been doing for like a decade leading up to that point is the kind of work that it would take to design a symbol set like this, because it's complex. Like it's really like it's amazingly like impossibly complex, and the sheer amount of information that it organizes about all of these different rites of masonry is astonishing, and all of these are regular Freemasonry. This is not Cagliostro's Egyptian Freemasonry, i.e., there were no women. These are not Masonic degrees that a woman could hold. So, also, Waite really took his vows of silence on Masonic and other private societies stuff pretty seriously. And there is no way that he would have broken his vows in order to give information to Pamela Coleman Smith. And he even says in his autobiography that he had to spoon feed her on 3 of the Trumps Major. And he also says that in general, he supervised the creation of these cards so that no free-floating images from his own mind or another would go through.
I want to just keep steering this boat in this direction of what you're talking about. So going a little deeper here, then, what are some of these symbolic themes that you're talking about? Like, what are some of the themes that Waite, you could say integrated or brought out from the tarot, and because you said broadly that he did these. So what are some of the consistent symbolic themes that we find then?
Okay, well, the biggest theme that you're going to find if you look at Waite's rectified tarot is that of union. This is union with a capital U, the way of divine union. This is something that you see in his minor arcana as much as in his major arcana. I'd say probably the card that shows it the most clearly and the most explicitly is in the minor arcana, and that's the 2 of Cups, where you have a man and a woman, and they are toasting. And above them, you have the caduceus of Hermes, and then you have a lion's head on top of the caduceus, and it's winged. And there's a lot that can be said about the symbol, but something that should be noted is that that the young man is holding a cup, and then he is reaching for the other cup that is being handed to him by the woman. So you look at it, and at first it's clear that they're drinking together, that this is meant to imply like a toast, a covenant of some kind. But his hand is reaching out to take the second cup from her. And this is something that Waite talks about. He says that in Christian mysticism, there are 2 mystical marriages. There's the one that happens here and the one that happens hereafter. And the 2 mystical marriages are a key concept in Waite's writing. That's what this image is about. He says in his commentary that there's stuff about this that goes well beyond divination. Like if you look at the 2 of Cups in Pictorial Key, he actually gets so excited talking about how there are things that go beyond the scope of divinatory meanings here that he actually forgets to list the reversed meanings and doesn't even put down reverse meanings for the card. It's not just that the card resists reversal, like some things it says, oh, it means the same thing when it's reversed. He just forgot to put it there because at a certain point he just stopped caring. He's like, well, I like to bring these old divinatory meanings in and make them connect things together. And man, I've done a lot of work showing that that's actually a really important subject. But the thing is that these images have everything in them aside from whatever divinatory meanings he's assigned to them, and he designed them. There's no question about that. The another example of a symbol of union is the rainbow that appears on the Ten of Cups. You have a four-person family beneath it: a mother, a father, a son, a daughter. Anyone who has got basic knowledge of Kabbalism will know that there's the four-letter name of God that's associated with the principles of mother, father, son, and daughter. And this is something that was talked about in the Golden Dawn, but it wasn't talked about in the same way that Waite talks about it in works like the Holy Kabbalah. And Waite's Holy Kabbalah is definitely, in my opinion, the book. If you're only going to read one book on Hebrew mysticism, you got to read the Holy Kabbalah.
I totally agree.
Yeah, there's going to be somewhere out there a Hebrew Kabbalist listening to this who says, "No, don't read that. That's Christian Kabbalism." But guys, we have to lighten up about the idea that there's like a Hebrew Kabbalism and a Christian Kabbalism. The Zohar was written in 13th century Spain. And 13th century Spain had Muslims in it, it had Catholics in it, it had heretics in it, there were Neoplatonists, like, on every single side. And there is no way that the messianic material in the Zohar is just like pure Hebrew Kabbalism any more than we have pure Egyptian tarot symbolism. Like there is nothing like that anywhere.
Right.
Like there's not some impossibly like solid lineage that we're just gonna like hook it onto and like, you know, Sefer Yetzirah, like, all right, we can backdate this as much as we want, but there's Platonism in Sefer Yetzirah.
Absolutely. And that's not even going into how Gematria originates in Pythagorean Isosephia and probably came about in Alexandria when, you know, the Old Testament was translated into Greek. I mean, it just goes on forever.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're going to read a book on Kabbalah, I like the Holy Kabbalah because it will give you a good picture of the historical development without a lot of nonsense attached to it. Waite does not really have a stake in the historical argument because he doesn't care when it arose. And it also focuses specifically on the mystery of union, which is a very interesting subject. It ties in with a lot of mysteries of sex in other religions. There is some stuff that, if you are into Kundalini yoga and all of that stuff, if you're into Vedic religion, you will see that it is very, very similar material being talked about there. And Waite is familiar with the Vedic stuff. I'm not sure what the state of availability was when he was alive, but he references it in a way of divine union and acknowledges that that there is not a specific religion tied to mysticism, and that the mystical process is something that kind of transcends a specific doctrine or sect.
Cool. So, other than the union symbolism, what other major themes are there for you?
Okay, major themes going on. Well, I mean, union is the overarching thrust of it, but you also get this idea of veiled nature. This is an idea that has been around for a very long time. You go back to like Day is a Day, where you have like veiled Isis, and she is later allegorized as being, oh, she's not a pagan goddess, she's like nature, she's the natural world, she's like she's creation. And so then you have Christian and otherwise Abrahamic interpretations where it's like, well, oh, this is God's creation, which veils God underneath. And so nature in her naked and unveiled form becomes an image of God. And you have that on the star trump. You have nature with a little bit of a veil on the world trump, just so the veil is like poised, like ready to to come off. The unveiling of nature is the taking off of the pictured forms, the same stuff that we were talking about earlier with Waite's view of symbolism. And taking off that veil of nature is kind of the process of Waite's mystical endeavor, and that's what his tarot is about. So you have the high priestess too, and she's in front of a veil, and she has a veil on her head, and she embodies the reflected light of the moon, which is sort of like the same sense of like indirectness, of like seeing something through something else by means of reflection. That you have like the veil and the light filtering through it, and sort of illuminating the pictures upon the veil. It's the same symbolism as the moon reflecting the sun's light, the sun usually being understood as God, whereas the moon is associated with Mary, at least in the Christian paradigm. But this is a symbolism quite a bit older than Christianity, which was familiar to the Greeks, and you find it in the Persianate world, and it's been around. But I'd say that's besides union, there's the symbol of the person you're unifying with, and that is this like ultimate magic girlfriend, veiled nature,
or the anima mundi.
Yes, exactly. This is something that will probably be obvious to anyone who has spent some time with the tarot. But I think that that even if we're like, oh yeah, we understand the veil of the high priestess, like we need to get used to the fact that this is something that is so difficult to understand that like Waite at the end of his life was still probably trying to understand it, and that there is something extremely, extremely deep and like almost kind of like shattering about this experience of seeing nature unveiled. And this comes out in the Rosicrucian symbolism too, because you have Christian Rosenkreutz goes into the basement of the castle in the Chemical Wedding, gets led down there, and he sees the goddess Venus unveiled, sleeping on her couch. And when she wakes, says the plaque that's by her, she'll give birth to a king. And later he gets in trouble for this transgression because he wasn't supposed to go down there. And it's implied that he will miss out on a really important initiatic experience because he saw things that he was not supposed to do and transgressed. But then the story breaks off really suddenly, and it's like he went to bed thinking that he was going to be in huge trouble, but in the morning he just returned home. And it's like, wait, what? like what happened here? What is this experience of seeing nature unveiled? That like, this is this idea of like being punished for this forbidden encounter with the body of Venus is something that you also see in older German material. It's in Tannhauser, where the poet Knight goes into the mountain, and this is like a lot of those folk stories where someone's going to like the realm of the people under the hill or whatever, the fairies. Sometimes King Arthur is there. Sometimes it's Emperor Barbarossa. Sometimes it's, whatever king they decided to graft onto it, whatever king meant kingliness at the time that the story was being told, they would stick it on there, or whatever figure they were assigning to, like feminine sexual power, oftentimes will be there. They call her Venus most often.
You're tying in perfectly here, because I was about to actually ask you about the Rosicrucian elements in the tarot, and B, the Grail mysteries that Waite integrated into the tarot. And you talk about that in your essay in Clavis. But I
Yeah.
want to ask you about that, the Grail mysteries, how they relate to the sort of pre-Christian Rosicrucianism, and how Waite integrated that into the tarot.
And didn't Waite write a
Well,
book on the Grail?
yes, he did, and it is the first one to feature information about the tarot, at least in the way that he would start to talk about it once Pictorial Key was, or I guess at the time it was just the Key, was out there. In 1909, he put out Hidden Church of the Holy Grail, and this is a book that can be difficult if you have not familiarized yourself already with the sources of Grail mythology. The one that, if anyone is listening who wants to do this, if you want to start, go pick up Burton Raffles' translation of Chrétien de Troyes. His Percival is awesome. And Percival is the story of the Grail. You'll be enjoying it so much that you'll be disappointed once again when this story is also incomplete. Chrétien died before he finished it. But the interesting thing about this is that it caused all of these other writers to be like, oh my God, we have to finish this story. We have to know what happens. And essentially what goes on is that Percival, this knight, is, he doesn't start out as a knight. He's just a kid. He gets kept away from knightly experiences or like knowing about knights because his mom is afraid that he will run off and try to be a knight. As soon as he finds out about knights, he's like, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And his mom is very upset. But he goes and he does it. He becomes a knight. And maybe because he is like so cut off from the world, or maybe he's just dumb. He is described as being horribly Welsh, which is maybe a way of saying that he's supposed to be like a complete idiot. And, I mean, I don't feel that way about Welsh people, but I think maybe the author of this did. But
That's how I feel about
yeah.
Dominic.
Yeah, my wife thinks I'm
Yeah.
Welsh.
Well, Percival is characterized as being kind of a dumb loudmouth who's not able to do anything socially acceptable, but he's like so innately talented and so great that he's able to just succeed at everything that he tries instantly. And he's very used to succeeding. But then he accidentally stumbles into the hidden Grail Castle, which sort of stands in for the mountain that you can go inside to enter into the realm of the spirit or whatever. And he sees a procession of different hallows. These are like holy relics that are being paraded by the dinner table. And he sees among them one thing which is described as being a grail, and no one really knows what this word means precisely. It seems to indicate some sort of a dish that you would have at a table, maybe a cup, maybe like a shallow platter that you use to hold a fish with some sauce on it or something maybe. This is maybe a little bit suggestive because of the Christian association with fish. But anyway, the Grail is in that original, or I guess I don't want to say original because it appears to be drawn from traditional materials, but in that first version of the story of the Grail by Chrétien, we have these things being paraded by, and Percival fails to ask who the Grail serves. Who is it for? What is the meaning of all of this stuff? And I think that maybe this is allegorical of, these symbols and images of various systems, including the tarot, are paraded by us. This panoply of images faces us every day as we see the veil of nature all around us, and we fail to ask, who does it serve? And because he doesn't ask who it serves, the king, who is in a state of illness, is not healed. The curse is not broken. Everything good that could have come of him asking who it serves doesn't happen, and he gets kicked out of the castle, or he goes out of the castle and can't come back, rather. And the first thing that happens is he runs into this girl, and she's like, there's no castle around here. What are you talking about? And he's like, oh, I went in this crazy castle. It was really weird. And she's like, you're such an idiot. That was obviously the Grail Castle. And so he experiences a lot of regret. And then it goes into this sort of subplot about Gwaine, and he's doing a lot of knightly stuff. And we never really get back around to the redemption of Percival, if that is what was going to happen. But a lot of authors do try to redeem Percival. And that's what all these continuations are about. Waite's tarot is about redemption, as all of his work is. Waite's main interest was restoration of humanity back to its proper place, and it's a very positive philosophy because it's similar in many ways to Buddhism, and I guess as Waite says, the mystic is kind of carrying all faiths to some extent in his heart, because at the bottom of mysticism, or the top or the middle, or whatever kind of spatial metaphor you're going to use, again, Waite says we speak in terms of space, but it's not really about space. There is just one thing, and this is the one thing of alchemy. And you can see that these systems are sort of blurring together, and this blurring effect, this is what Waite called the secret tradition in Christian times. There's a guy named Richard Mason to watch out for, who's doing a lot of study about what Waite meant by that term, secret tradition in Christian times. And he's doing very, very good work right now. And his book will probably come out before too long.
Well, and that brings me to a question I want to ask you related to what you just said, which is, what would you say Waite meant by the hidden church of the Holy Grail, or the hidden church?
Well, I mean, this is a question that that maybe has. I mean, historians will give you a simple answer. They'd say, well, Karl von Eckarthausen wrote Cloud Upon the Sanctuary, and it describes what appears to be some kind of like secret church within the church, and that's what it is. And this is the explanation that people tend to give. But long before then, we get the interior castle of Teresa of Avila. Waite talks about Saint Teresa a lot, and this is also a hidden church of sorts. And what we should really understand is that all of these various things. There's a thing in Waite's mythos, in his fairy stories, which are really amazing, and I have an ambition to put them out into the world again. There's a lot of, he would basically just write the same stories over and over again and revise them into different forms, and it's really, really fascinating as a study of symbolism. But you often get houses and buildings, and this intersects actually with some of his Kabbalistic stuff. He talks about how a house is always a woman. It's an odd statement, but I think that it is not out of line with the fact that the high priestess is, at least in one system, associated with the Hebrew letter, which corresponds to a house. And there is no good system of Hebrew letter assignment in Waite's opinion. He's like, all of it is kind of made up. But occasionally he sees glimmers of the good symbolism in it. And this symbolism is something that's been around. Like, it is the idea that there is a hidden sanctuary is something that occasionally inspires people to make a real hidden sanctuary. And there are certainly those still in the world today, where people who, for whatever reason, feel that they cannot pursue spiritual matters because the world around them is not friendly to a life of the spirit, they will draw together, or maybe they will pursue in isolation, but spiritually connected with other people who also pursue in isolation these kinds of mystical quests, and they work towards as I said, a shared end, towards one thing. And that's actually what it says on Waite's tombstone. There's only one thing. It's an interesting epitaph.
Very cool.
But that hidden church, for Waite, in the simplest terms, is something that it would be a real organization that you could go and visit, maybe even in like a building that is assigned to it, or like, maybe it meets in a Masonic lodge, maybe it meets in someone's house, maybe it meets on the street or in pubs. The hidden church, the real hidden church, is interior. It's in the heart, and that way of the heart that Saint Martin taught is tied up in Waite's conception of what that hidden church really is.
Precisely.
Hidden in us.
Precisely. And I think that relates to the idea of interiority and the imaginal, as opposed to imagination, but the imaginal realm, such as like Henry Corbin spoke about. And I think that is more the province of that interior ecclesia. And interestingly, as a side note, I think perhaps his mention that a house is a woman, perhaps that could be related back to Kabbalah, with the sense that Shekinah relates to a tent, or a dwelling place in the wilderness, and then that kind of relates back to the concept of ecclesia being depicted, for instance, by Hildegard of Bingen as a feminine presence, really as Sophia.
Yeah. I think that you're thinking very much along the same lines as Waite was here. And I think that anyone who spends a good deal of time with mystical subjects will come to these conclusions. And, I want to make it clear that when people talk about a hidden church, especially in the 19th century, drawing from Eliphas Levi and other guys like him, you get this kind of notion that all religions teach the same thing, and that there is like one way to be discovered, like the religion behind all religions, or the tarot is the Bible of Bibles and all of that. And this is so fucked up, because people will basically, especially Eliphas Levi, who is total asshole. Like he is. Everyone has good things to say about him. I don't think anyone tried to read his books. This guy sucks. Like he hates Indian people. He's like really, really down on Indian people and Indian religion, and he he has awful things to say about women. Like Crowley, everyone knows Crowley is a jerk, but people don't give his supposed former incarnation of Eliphas Levi as enough credit for being a huge jerk. But so he has this idea that he managed to spread to like so much of the occult world, or whatever you want to call it, that was cropping up in the 19th century, that all religions are teaching the same thing, that the tarot is the Bible of Bibles, and that everything is like encapsulated in all systems in the same way. And this is just not true. People who say that all religions teach the same thing have not studied enough religions. They all have totally individual maps of human consciousness that they have lovingly delineated over who knows how many centuries or millennia, and they are all unique, and it would be a considerable loss if even one of them were to be gone without being to be revived. So, like, the thing about it, the way I have explained it to my students, is that when it comes to mysticism, it is like you are climbing a mountain. And you may have climbed a mountain, but you cannot say that you climbed another person's mountain, that somebody else may be climbing a different mountain. And their experience is like totally individual. It's kind of like an existential thing that You didn't climb all mountains, you climbed your mountain. And maybe a religion is like a mountain range. Somebody climbing in the Pyrenees is not climbing in the Himalayas. But the thing is that people who have been to that same altitude know what it is to be up there. And they will
Yes.
recognize that in each other, I think. And
Yes.
they say, I haven't been to your mountain, but I've been up there. And I think they maybe also see the same horizon. So,
very interesting way to put it.
Yeah, there is something to this Rosicrucian mountain business, I think, and the idea of going inside the mountain is pretty close to the idea of going up on top of the mountain. Again, space and distance are not such a thing. And whether we're talking about one historical iteration of it or another, there is a human experience which is real, which is described in Waite's Way of Divine Union, and he says it can be obtained on these different paths, that the Thomist will walk away from it a more convinced Thomist, and the Vedantist will walk away from it a more convinced Vedantist.
Yeah, perfect.
And
on that,
it's truth. There's truth at the bottom of the well.
absolutely. And that's we go into that, regularly on here too, is that this isn't just about learning a bunch of information or, assimilating and memorizing unusual information to present it to other people as a form of social quantum. There's a purpose behind all of this, and that is a direct experience. But the direct experience loses something in translation. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, so let's talk about the second set of tarot trumps that he designed, and what it was employed for, what it was used for.
Well, okay. So I'm not a member of the FRC, so I will try to answer that question as well as I can with the publicly available materials. And as you know, if you've read Secret Tradition and Silence, those materials are imperfect. There's an out-of-date version of the FRC rituals out there. Waite kept on working on these things until he died, basically, and he did finish them to his satisfaction. Like basically, like at the moment of death, he's like, "Okay, it's good," and I mean, like that must have been what killed him after working so long. He's like trying to get to this point. I think it must have stopped his heart to realize he had finished. But I guess we reached the end of mystical activity, and there is a place of rest. And I think he probably entered into that place of rest, a happy man. But he kept on working on that stuff basically the whole time. And what we have is only like the first draft of the FRC rituals. It was leaked under really, really weird circumstances at the beginning of the 21st century. And there's some images of his second tarot that he designed for the FRC. Some people may not know about this, even though it's been out there. There's been information about it sort of circulating since about the 1980s. Bob Gilbert talked about it a little bit at a Golden Dawn thing. I think it was in the 90s. So, I mean, it was being discussed, but people did not really realize the magnitude of what this is. And the person who dug it up, well, I say he dug it up, but he purchased it on eBay under very, very suspicious circumstances. A gentleman by the name of Marcus Katz. He's
a charlatan. That's what he is. He's a joke.
Yeah, Marcus Katz sucks. I'm not going to waste words on him because he's not worth it. Waite never wasted words on Crowley, and we should follow Waite's example. But suffice to say, when he attached Peter Gabriel lyrics to these images and said that they were the explanation for them, or when he took ideas from Aleister Crowley and said that they were like there to explain Waite's tarot. The reason for this is because the FRC threatened to sue the pants off him if he did anything with this stuff. And I mean, the materials that we have by which I can talk to you about this stuff are not sufficient for me to say anything really that good. But what I will tell you is that they were not designed for divination. They were designed for the ritual use of the fellowship, that they are mystical images that show the 22 major cards plus an extra one for Doth. And so Doth, for those who don't know, is a concept in Kabbalism. It corresponds to knowledge, and there's a lot that can be said about Doth that I'm just not going to say because it's a lot. But this set of images is out there now, and unfortunately, it is out there without anyone to give a really good explanation of why Waite created them. I think that probably even with everything that Waite ever wrote about them, they remain something of a mystery, as all true mysteries do. But they were used in order to illustrate some of the conceptions of the mystical process that Waite developed after he had left the Golden Dawn system and sort of extended everything that he saw that was beneficial in it, which mostly lasted over, I think, from former Rosicrucian systems that it drew from. And he attempted to create a real Rosicrucian group in the spirit of the old ones, and he may have actually gotten the charters to do this. No one really knows who the Rosicrucians were or are. And if you're out there listening, Brothers of the Rose Cross, thanks. Because it is thanks to them that we have these images to puzzle over. And certainly puzzling over them has enriched my life. And I started this journey with tarot cards as an atheist. And I am no longer an atheist because there have been a lot of experiences that I've had by looking at these symbols and thinking about the things that they represent that that reveal to me something about myself and my consciousness and what they have to say is profound beyond anything that I could have created for myself. I don't think I have read these things in. I think that they're there to transmit something good. So
very nice.
I hope that anyone who encounters these images will simply take them for what they are and read Waite's work, because honestly, all of the mysteries are not locked up behind some kind of initiatic paywall. You just have to read his books, and they're on archive.org. They're like, in used book bins. They're collecting dust because people don't read these things, and it's there for you to read. It's so available. It's more available than it's ever been at a lower price of entry than it's ever been. As Waite said, in matters of the spirit, it's sort of a matter of supply and demand. And the joke there is that there is an infinite supply and there is no demand. So we get this for free.
Well,
or close to free. You'll not get Waite's books in first edition for free. I'll tell you that much.
Hey, I hate to say it, guys, but I think we're coming to the end of our time. I don't know if you wanted to touch on anything else, Janice or Stuart.
No,
Now's the time.
I thought that was great. And it's true. It's all hidden in plain sight. People need to do the work. It's about that. Just do the work.
Cool. So,
Yeah.
Stuart, is there a way for people to follow you, follow what you're doing, and keep up to date on the book? Do you do? I assume you do tarot readings. Is it possible if someone listening wanted to get a tarot reading from you to get that done?
Yeah. Yeah. I can give you guys my email. It's my name, Stuart Sudekum, StuartSudekum @gmail.com. Just write me. I'm available. I'm involved in so many projects, both public and private, at this point that like I have little time to do events and stuff. I was doing event organizing for a long time, but I've definitely been absorbed in the creation of this book for a long time. But I do have a class that I teach on this material that anyone who is really interested can just write me and I'll send you a syllabus, and it's open to anybody who wants to learn.
Awesome. Thanks, Stuart. I mean, you're a fountain of information on this topic, and I really, and I'll speak for Janice as well, really appreciate you coming on to take the time and talk to us about this.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you
dude.
so much. Yeah, it was an honor.
All right. Catch you later.
Okay, there we go. The episode is all wrapped up, and we hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to say thank you to Stuart again for his time and for all the great info that he was able to share with us. We look forward to talking to him again. Stuart, we'd love to have you back on the show. Keep us updated with your book. We are really looking forward to that. Otherwise, we are done with this episode. You can always find us on Facebook. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with us. And we have a website, themagicianandthefool.com, if you want to go that route, and email. We appreciate you being here with us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.